June Pruitt walked into my shop on a Tuesday morning with a resume in one hand and grease already under her fingernails from changing her own brake pads that same week, and asked flat out if I was hiring. I looked at the mess of invoices on my desk, the calendar I hadn't updated since March, the general disaster of a man who'd spent 6 years running his father's shop alone and forgotten what a functioning personal life looked like, and said the first thing that came to mind. Honestly, what I actually need is a wife, not an employee, someone to remind me to eat lunch and file my taxes on time. I don't suppose that's on your resume. I want it on the record that I meant it entirely as a joke about my own chaotic life, not about her qualifications. And I want it equally on the record that June did not receive it that way at all. That's an interesting response to a job application, she said, arms crossed, not remotely amused. I drove 40 minutes to hand you a resume that says I've been rebuilding engines since I was 16, and your response is a joke about needing a wife. I'd like to know if that's a rejection, or if you'd actually like to look at my qualifications before deciding I'm better suited for domestic labor than skilled trade work. I felt the specific, immediate horror of a joke landing nowhere close to where I'd intended it. That's not what I meant. I mean, my life is a mess, personally, unrelated to your resume, which I haven't even looked at yet. Then look at it, she said, sliding it across the counter with more force than strictly necessary. And maybe workshop the delivery on that joke before you try it on the next woman who walks in here for a job. I'm Beckett Hollis, 33. I inherited this shop from my father 6 years ago, when his hands finally gave out after 4 decades of engine work, and I have run it, more or less successfully, entirely alone since, a fact that had apparently become obvious enough to a stranger within 4 minutes of meeting me, that she'd correctly diagnosed my joke as coming from genuine, unglamorous loneliness, rather than any actual doubt about her mechanical skill. My father built this shop from a single bay and a second-hand lift in 1987, grew it slowly into the 6-bay operation I'd taken over, and handed it to me with a specific piece of advice I'd apparently been failing to follow for 6 years straight. Don't let the work eat your whole life, Beck. I did that, and your mother left because of it, and I don't want that particular family tradition continuing. I'd nodded along at the time, genuinely intending to heed it, and then promptly spent 6 years doing exactly what he'd warned against, the shop consuming every waking hour until I woke up one Tuesday morning to realize I hadn't been on a date in over 2 years and couldn't fully remember the last time I'd eaten a meal that wasn't standing up at my workbench. I looked at her resume properly, this time, standing in my own shop feeling appropriately chastened. 6 years of hands-on mechanical work, most of it informal, learned from a father and older brother who'd run their own small operation 2 towns over until it closed 8 months earlier when the property got sold out from under them. Solid references. A specific, detailed list of engine rebuilds that read like the resume of someone who actually knew what she was doing, not someone padding a page to look qualified. This is a strong resume, I admitted. I apologize for the joke. It was about my own disaster of a personal life, not a comment on your competence, though I recognize that context wasn't remotely obvious from how it came out. Apology noted, June said, still cool, though something in her posture had relaxed slightly. I'd still like an actual interview if the position's real and not just an excuse to make bad jokes at job applicants. The position's real. I could use the help. Genuinely, I've been turning away work for months because I physically can't keep up alone. We did the interview properly after that, standing in the bay next to a half-disassembled sedan, June answering technical questions with the specific, unhesitating confidence of someone who'd actually done the work rather than just studied it. Walk me through how you'd diagnose a rough idle, I said, mostly to see how she thought through a problem rather than just recited an answer. Depends on the symptoms. Is it consistent or intermittent? Does it happen cold or after the engine's warmed up? I'd start by checking the idle air control valve, then move to vacuum leaks, then spark plugs if the first 2 check out clean. I wouldn't guess. I'd actually listen to the engine first because half the diagnosis is in the sound before you ever pop the hood. That's the correct answer, for the record. Most people jump straight to spark plugs and skip the actual listening part. Most people are wrong then. My dad used to say an engine tells you exactly what's wrong if you're patient enough to actually hear it, instead of assuming. She diagnosed a problem with the sedan's timing belt in about 90 seconds, faster than I would have managed myself, walking me through her reasoning with the specific clarity of someone who genuinely understood the mechanics rather than pattern matching from memorized symptoms. I hired her on the spot, mostly because turning down that level of competence over a badly delivered joke would have been genuinely stupid business. For the record, I said once we'd shaken on it, I really am sorry about the wife comment. I'll workshop the delivery, as requested. See that you do? I don't intend to spend my first month here fielding more of that particular brand of humor. Understood. I'll aim for jokes that don't accidentally imply I think you're better suited to domestic labor than skilled trade work. Low bar, but I'll clear it. That's already an improvement over the opening line. Here's what you need to know about June Pruitt before anything else happens. She's 29, sharp, deeply unimpressed by anyone who underestimates her based on assumptions rather than actual observation, and genuinely, thoroughly excellent at her job in a way that became obvious within her first week at the shop. She'd grown up in her father's garage, learned engines the way some kids learn piano, developed the specific calloused, practical competence of someone who'd been proving herself in a male-dominated trade since she was old enough to hold a wrench. She didn't talk much about her old shop closing, beyond the bare facts. The building sold, her father retiring earlier than planned, her older brother finding work elsewhere. June left job hunting in a trade that didn't always take her seriously on site. She mentioned once, early on, the specific exhausting math of job hunting as a woman in her field. The interviews that turned into skill quizzes no male applicant ever seemed to face. The shops that hired her for front desk work, despite her resume clearly listing hands-on mechanical experience. The low, persistent assumption that she must be less qualified than her credentials suggested, simply because of how she looked standing in a garage doorway. Your shop's the first one in 4 months that actually let me touch an engine during the interview instead of just asking me to smile at customers, she told me, a few weeks in, with the specific, hard-won relief of someone who'd stopped expecting basic fairness as a given. That's a low bar for the industry to be clearing. It really is. Doesn't make me any less grateful you cleared it. Badly delivered joke notwithstanding. The first few weeks were entirely professional, both of us settling into a working rhythm that had nothing to do with the awkward opening joke. June was, if anything, better than her resume suggested. Fast, precise, good with customers in a way I'd never quite managed myself. My own social skills having atrophied considerably during 6 years of solo operation. She had a gift for explaining complicated repairs to nervous customers without condescension, breaking down exactly what was wrong and why in plain language that left people feeling informed instead of overwhelmed, a skill I'd genuinely never developed myself, despite 2 decades in the trade. I found myself, somewhere around week 3, looking forward to the mornings in a way I hadn't in longer than I wanted to examine. The shop feeling less like a lonely daily grind and more like an actual place with another person in it who made the work better just by being present. We developed an easy rhythm, her handling the front counter and diagnostics while I focused on the heavier mechanical work, both of us falling into the specific, comfortable shorthand of 2 competent people who respected each other's skill enough not to need constant explanation. I want to be honest about when I first noticed the shift because it wasn't dramatic. It was small, cumulative, the specific gradual realization of a man who'd been too consumed with keeping a business alive to notice he was developing feelings until they were already fairly substantial. It was somewhere around the 5th week, watching June troubleshoot a particularly stubborn transmission issue with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. Grease smudged across one cheek, entirely unself-conscious about it, that I understood I'd stopped thinking of her purely as an excellent hire and started thinking of her as someone I very much wanted to know outside the specific context of engine repair. I didn't say anything, for weeks, mostly because the power dynamic sat uncomfortably with me. I was, after all, her boss. in a position that made any romantic overture inherently complicated regardless of how it was delivered. I told myself the professional distance was the responsible choice, and mostly believed it. Right up until the afternoon, June herself brought up the subject directly, with the same blunt honesty she'd used on her first day. We'd been working late, closing up after a particularly long day, both of us tired in the specific companionable way that comes from a full day of shared physical work. I was locking up the register when she spoke, without much preamble. "Can I ask you something?" she said, wiping her hands on a shop rag. "And I need you to actually answer honestly instead of deflecting with another terrible joke." "I'll do my best. No promises on the joke-free part. Do you have feelings for me? Because I think I might have feelings for you, and I've spent 3 weeks trying to talk myself out of it. Mostly because I don't want to become the kind of story people tell about the female mechanic who slept her way into favorable treatment at work." I set down the wrench I'd been holding, giving the question the full attention it deserved. "I do," I admitted. "I have, for a few weeks now. I haven't said anything because I didn't want you to feel like your job here was contingent on reciprocating something you didn't actually want. That's the exact fear I've been sitting with too, just from the other direction. If we do this, and it goes badly, I lose the best job I've had in years because things got complicated. If we do this and people find out, every single one of my qualifications gets quietly recategorized as favoritism instead of actual skill, no matter how good my work actually is. I understand that fear. I don't have a clean solution for it, honestly. I can tell you that nothing about your position here has ever been about anything other than your actual competence, and that won't change regardless of what happens between us personally. But I recognize that promise doesn't erase the risk on your end. It doesn't, but I appreciate you naming it instead of pretending the risk isn't real." June was quiet for a long moment, processing. "I need to think about it properly. Not because I don't want to say yes right now, but because I want to make sure I'm choosing this with clear eyes, not just because the tension's been building for weeks and it would be easier to just give in to it." "Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere." That's a generous offer from a man who apparently hasn't been on a date in 2 years, according to my own math based on how genuinely surprised you looked when I mentioned Friday plans last week. I contain multitudes. Mostly work, apparently, but the occasional genuine feeling sneaks through eventually. I called my father that same week, mostly because I needed to talk through the situation with someone who'd actually run this shop before me, and might have useful perspective on mixing business with something personal. "You're asking my permission or my advice?" he said, once I'd explained the situation. "Advice, mostly. I don't need permission at 33, but I trust your read on this more than most people's. My read is that you've been alone in that shop for 6 years, working yourself into the ground exactly the way I warned you not to, and now a genuinely qualified woman walks in and you're worried about complicating things by actually letting yourself feel something. Sounds like you've already made the mistake I made, just with extra steps of overthinking added on top. That's uncomfortably direct. I'm 71, Beck. I don't have the energy left for indirect. If she's as good a mechanic as you say, and you actually like her beyond the obvious, stop treating this like a business risk assessment and start treating it like a life you might actually want to have. What if it goes badly? What if I lose a good employee over a relationship that doesn't work out? What if it goes well and you spend the next 30 years running this shop with someone who actually understands what the work costs you, instead of alone in an office at midnight doing paperwork by yourself the way I did for years after your mother left? There's risk either way, son. I'd rather you take the risk that might actually make you happy. I sat with that conversation for the rest of the week, my father's characteristic bluntness cutting through weeks of careful hesitation in a way June's own directness had already started to model for me. She took 4 days of careful professional normalcy that felt considerably more charged than it had before the conversation happened, both of us aware of the questions sitting unanswered between us during every routine interaction. The midpoint of this story, if I'm being honest, isn't actually about June and me directly. It's about a customer named Roy Pemberton, a longtime client of my father's who'd been bringing his truck to this shop for over 20 years, who showed up on the 3rd of June's 4 days of consideration with a transmission problem and considerably more opinions about who should be allowed to touch his vehicle than I'd anticipated needing to manage. Roy was, in most respects, a decent enough customer. Reliable, prompt about payment. The specific old-fashioned loyalty of a man who'd trusted this shop through 2 generations of ownership. He was also, apparently, entirely unprepared for the shop's newest addition. "Where's Beckett?" he asked when June greeted him at the counter, his tone carrying the specific dismissiveness of a man who hadn't even considered the possibility that the person in front of him might be the one he needed. "I need the real mechanic, not the receptionist." "I'm the mechanic," June said, level and professional despite what I could tell was genuine irritation building underneath. "I've been working here 2 months. I'd be happy to take a look at your transmission." "No offense, sweetheart, but I've had this truck 20 years. I'd rather have someone who actually knows engines handle it, not just someone answering phones." "None taken," June said, though her jaw had tightened in a way that suggested considerable offense actually had been taken, professionally suppressed. "For what it's worth, based on the sound of your engine idling in the parking lot just now, I'd guess you're looking at a failing torque converter, possibly compounded by low fluid. I could be wrong. I'd need to actually look at it to confirm." Roy blinked, visibly caught off guard by a diagnosis delivered before he'd even finished parking, but didn't fully soften his skepticism. "I'll wait for Beckett." I was in the back bay, close enough to hear the entire exchange, and felt a specific, immediate protective anger rise that I had to consciously manage rather than let explode across the shop floor. I walked out front, deliberately calm, taking a breath before I spoke. "Roy," I said, "June's one of the best mechanics I've ever worked with. She diagnosed your exact transmission issue from the sound uln before you even finished describing the symptoms. If you want the most qualified person on this floor handling your truck, that's her, not me." Roy looked between us, clearly uncomfortable, the specific discomfort of a man confronting an assumption he hadn't fully examined until it was named directly. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said weakly. "Just used to how things have always been done here." "I understand that. I'm telling you how things are done here now. June handles your truck, or you take your business somewhere else. Those are the actual options." There was a long, uncomfortable pause, Roy visibly weighing 20 years of loyalty against wounded pride, before he finally sighed and handed over his keys. "Fine. Fix the transmission, or whatever it is. I'll be in the waiting room." Roy left his truck, grumbling but compliant, and June fixed the transmission issue in under an hour, textbook clean work that even Roy, once he'd picked up his truck and heard it running smoothly for the first time in months, had to grudgingly admit was impressive. "Runs better than it has in a year," he admitted, almost against his own will, standing in the parking lot listening to his own engine with visible surprise. "I'll say that much." "Glad I could help," June said, professional to the end, though I caught the small, satisfied flicker of vindication behind her composed expression. "You didn't have to do that," June told me once Roy had left. "The whole defending me thing, I've handled worse than Roy Pemberton plenty of times without a boss stepping in. I know you could have handled it. I wasn't stepping in because I doubted your ability to handle it yourself. I stepped in because it's my shop, and I don't want customers who can't respect the actual expertise standing in front of them, regardless of whether you needed rescuing or not." "That's a fair distinction," she said, something warmer moving behind her usual composure. "I've had bosses before who stepped in for exactly the wrong reasons, wanting to look like a hero or genuinely doubting I could handle a difficult customer myself. This felt different. It felt like you were defending a principle, not rescuing a damsel." "That's precisely what I was going for. Glad it landed correctly." "It did. For what it's worth, watching you actually back me up like that without making it about heroics moved something for me." She leaned against the counter, studying me for a long moment. "I think I've made my decision, actually, about the 4 days of consideration." "Already? It's only been 3. I did the math faster than expected. Watching you handle Roy sealed something I'd been circling for days." About the 4 days of consideration? About the 4 days of consideration. Yes, I'd like to try this. Both of us clear-eyed, both of us understanding the risks, both of us choosing it anyway. I didn't say anything clever back. I crossed the small distance of the shop's front counter, and the kiss that followed started careful. The specific careful of two people who'd spent weeks building toward exactly this moment and didn't want to rush the landing. Then it went warm, her hand finding the front of my shirt, streaked faintly with the day's work. And then, for one long, unhurried moment, it went past warm entirely, into something that made an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in an auto shop feel like exactly the right place for it to happen. We broke apart to the sound of the shop bell over the door, an actual customer walking in at the exact wrong moment, both of us laughing at the thoroughly unglamorous interruption to a genuinely significant moment. Very smooth, June said. Excellent timing on the universe's part. I'll arrange for better privacy next time, I promise. Don't. I think I'd miss the chaos if the shop suddenly started running on a considerate schedule. We took it slow after that, careful about how the relationship intersected with the professional side of things, both of us deliberate about keeping her qualifications and her personal life clearly separate in the eyes of anyone watching. We agreed early on to keep the relationship quiet at work for the first few months, not out of shame, but out of the same practical caution that had made June hesitate in the first place, wanting the shop's regular customers to see her competence established clearly before any personal complication became public knowledge. June's insistence on that separation didn't fade once we were officially together. If anything, she became more careful about it, taking on the shop's most difficult diagnostic work specifically to keep proving, to herself as much as anyone else, that her position had never been about anything but her actual skill. About 3 months in, June rebuilt an engine entirely on her own for the first time since joining the shop, a vintage muscle car a collector had brought in, convinced it was beyond saving, that most mechanics in the region had already turned away as not worth the labor. The car had sat in a barn for the better part of a decade, engine seized, wiring corroded, the specific kind of project most shops declined outright, rather than risk the labor hours on a vehicle that might never actually run again. I want this one, June told me, the day the collector dropped it off, practically vibrating with the specific excitement of a mechanic who'd found a genuine challenge. Entirely mine. No help, no oversight, just the work. You know this could take weeks, maybe longer, depending on what we find once we're actually inside it. I know, I want it anyway. I need to do something like this on my own, here, at this shop specifically, so nobody, including me, ever has room to wonder if my position here is about anything except what I can actually do with my hands. I understood the request immediately, and gave her the space without argument, redirecting other work to keep the shop running, while she disappeared into the muscle car project for what became 2 full weeks. She spent that time methodical and relentless, refusing my offers to help beyond the basic logistics of parts sourcing, determined to complete the entire rebuild as a demonstration, mostly to herself, of exactly what she was capable of, independent of any relationship complicating the picture. I watched her work, on the evenings I stayed late to keep her company without interfering. The specific, focused intensity she brought to a problem that most mechanics would have declared unsolvable. She rebuilt the carburetor from parts she'd sourced from 3 different specialty suppliers, rewired sections of the engine bay by hand, tested and retested each component before moving to the next, treating the entire project with the patient, exacting care of someone who understood that rushing would undo weeks of careful work in a single mistake. "How's the patient?" I asked one evening, bringing her coffee she hadn't asked for but accepted gratefully. Stubborn, like most things worth fixing properly. She wiped grease from her hands, studying the engine bay with the specific satisfaction of someone close to a breakthrough. "I think I'm 2 days out from testing it, maybe 3. No rush, take whatever time it actually needs." That's a very different sentiment from most bosses I've worked for. I'm not most bosses, and you're not most mechanics. Seemed worth adjusting my expectations accordingly. The engine turned over on the first try, 2.5 weeks after she'd started. The collector standing in the bay practically in tears at the sound of an engine he'd assumed was permanently dead, roaring back to life. June's face, in that moment, held the specific satisfaction of someone who'd just proven something significant. Not to me, not to Roy Pemberton, but to herself. That, I told her, once the collector had left, thrilled and considerably poorer for the excellent work, was genuinely the best rebuild I've seen come out of this shop in years, my father included. High praise. Deserved praise, I mean it. I've watched him rebuild engines for 20 years growing up in this shop, and I don't think I've seen patience like that from anyone, including him. She smiled at that, something settled and proud replacing the earlier tension that had followed her through those first careful months of the relationship. I needed to do that one entirely on my own. I hope you understand why. I understood before you even started. I would have offered the same space to anyone proving something that mattered to them. A year later, June and I got married in the shop's back lot. String lights hung between two support beams, folding chairs arranged around a floor still faintly stained with decades of motor oil despite our best cleaning efforts. It felt right, somehow, getting married in the exact space where an accidentally terrible joke about needing a wife had turned improbably into something entirely true. The vintage muscle car June had rebuilt sat parked near the makeshift altar, polished to a mirror shine, its owner having generously agreed to let it serve as a backdrop for the ceremony in gratitude for the rebuild that had saved it from the scrapyard. He'd driven 3 hours specifically to attend, insisting the least he could do was lend the car for the occasion. Given that June's 2 weeks of relentless, methodical work had brought back an engine every other shop in the region had declared unsalvageable, Roy Pemberton, invited despite his rocky introduction to June, gave a genuinely contrite toast, admitting in front of the assembled guests that he'd been proven spectacularly wrong about who belonged on this shop floor, and that his truck, 2 years later, still ran better than it had in over a decade, thanks to the mechanic he'd initially dismissed. Best 20-year customer relationship I've ever had to eat my own words over, he said, raising his glass. And June, standing beside me in a dress she'd insisted still needed pockets, laughed harder than I'd heard her laugh in months. I've sent him 3 referrals since that transmission job, June. I want that on the record, too, in case anyone's still doubting. Noted, Roy. Appreciated, even. My father, who'd driven up from his retirement home 2 states over for the occasion, pulled June aside at some point during the reception, a conversation she relayed to me later with visible emotion. He'd apparently told her, in his characteristically blunt way, that watching her run the shop had taught him something he'd never quite learned himself in 4 decades of ownership. That the work was better, not worse, for having more than one kind of expertise standing behind the counter. He said I remind him why he built the place in the first place, June told me. Something about doing good, honest work regardless of who's doing it. I think that might be the nicest thing anyone's said to me in this entire industry. He doesn't hand out compliments easily. You should feel genuinely honored. I do, actually, more than I expected to. I got to see June handle real pressure once more, about 8 months into our marriage, when a regional trade magazine did a feature on independent auto shops and sent a photographer and reporter to document a working day at Hollis and Pruitt. June, initially reluctant about the attention, ended up giving the most compelling interview of the piece, walking the reporter through a full engine diagnosis with the same patient, confident clarity she'd used on customers since her very first week. I got into this trade because engines make sense to me in a way people sometimes don't, she told the reporter, unprompted, while I watched from across the bay, quietly proud. There's nothing subjective about a properly diagnosed problem. It's either fixed correctly or it isn't. I've always found that clarity satisfying, especially in a field where people sometimes doubted whether I belonged here at all before I'd even opened my toolbox. The article ran with a photo of her mid-repair, grease on her cheek, exactly like that 5th week I'd first noticed my feelings shifting. The caption reading simply, June Pruitt, co-owner, believes good work speaks for itself. She kept a framed copy of that page in the shop's front office, not out of vanity, she insisted, but as a small, permanent reminder for any future customer who walked in with Roy Pemberton's original assumptions still intact. Roy himself, in the months following our wedding, became something of an unlikely advocate, mentioning June's work to anyone who'd listen at the diner he frequented, occasionally bringing in friends who needed repairs specifically because, as he put it, the woman there actually knows what she's doing, better than most men I've dealt with in this business. June found the transformation from skeptic to evangelist both amusing and, she admitted, quietly gratifying. I don't need his approval, she told me once, watching Roy chat up a new customer in our waiting room about the quality of the shop's work. But I won't pretend it doesn't feel good, watching him become one of my loudest advocates after that first conversation. You earned every bit of that transformation. He's just catching up to what was true from the start. My father visits the shop most months now, technically retired but unable to fully stay away, and has developed a habit of sitting in the corner office chair watching June work with the specific quiet approval of a man who'd built something and was genuinely pleased to see it thriving in capable hands beyond his own. Your mother would have liked her, he told me once, watching June troubleshoot a stubborn alternator with her usual patient focus. She always said this shop needed someone who actually loved the work instead of just tolerating it. Took you 6 years and a badly delivered joke to find her, but you got there eventually. I contain multitudes, apparently. Mostly stubbornness, but occasionally something useful catches up eventually. He laughed at that, the specific warm laugh of a father watching his son finally build the life he'd once hoped for him, and went back to watching June work, the two of us content for a while, to just observe her competence in comfortable silence. The shop runs on both our names now, painted fresh across the front window, Hollis and Pruitt Auto Repair, a small, permanent correction to every assumption anyone's ever made walking through that door about who's actually qualified to be standing on this side of the counter. What would you have done if a badly delivered joke turned into the realest thing you ever built? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.